Room 4. Fresh out of nursing school, I got my first real job in a fairly large hospital. It was a 6-bed cardiac ICU with rooms that overlooked the city capitol building. It was a very nice unit, and I started out working 12-hour night shifts. After working for over a year, I went on a long vacation. However, on my first night back, I received a report from the day charge nurse. She said she was off for a few days and suggested reminding the next day charge nurse that the priest was coming in the morning to bless room 4. I thought she was kidding at first, but she was serious. Apparently, while I was on vacation, every patient who was admitted to that room had died. But this came as no shock to me. People died often in our department, so I just shook it off. She then said that room 4 was empty and that it would serve as a code bed for the night. Around 2 a.m., I got a call saying that they have someone to fill our open bed. The ICU downstairs was now going to be code bed, so we were getting your average chest pain, take a look in the morning kind of patient. Nothing to get excited about. We get the patient admitted and all settled in room 4. He was a gentleman about 50 or so years old, very pleasant. His wife was with him and she looked dead on her feet. I got her some warm blankets and took her to our waiting room, which had cots so she could get some rest. Around 3:30, I was watching monitors and the cameras in each room. All the patients were fast asleep. The cameras all cycled through for about 3 seconds each on one small TV we had on the desk. Room 1 was fine, room 2 was fine, room 3 was fine, room 4. There was someone in there. It cycled too quickly for me to get a good look, and the doors to the unit were locked. Maybe the other nurse let his wife back in? I walked down the hall and glanced inside. There was nobody. I shrugged it off. It was late. I was tired. I was probably just seeing things. I went back to the desk and continued watching the screen. Room 1, room 2, room 3, room 4. I was not imagining anything. There was someone in room 4. The person was standing in the corner by the window, their figure completely draped in shadow. I could not move my body. It cycled through again. This time it was closer to the patient's bed, by maybe 2 or 3 feet. The hairs stood straight up on my neck. The next time it cycled through, it was even closer. It stood in the light coming from the hallway, but despite the light, it was still shrouded in darkness. It cycled through again, and it was right next to the bed. My heart started pounding, and I could barely squeak to the nurse on the other end of the desk. As soon as my words formed and I was able to make some kind of noise to get her attention, the alarm on the monitor went off, signaling that the patient was having a cardiac arrest. The overhead system came on. A cart is needed in CCU room 4. People poured into the department. Doctors, nurses, pharmacists, respiratory therapists. They all rushed into the room, but I couldn't move. It cycled through the rooms again. Room 4 came up, and this time the lights were on, and there were 10 to 15 people surrounding the bed, doing CPR and slamming meds into his IV. Someone went to get his wife from the waiting room. But there it was, in the opposite corner again. A dark figure watching this scene play out. Just standing there. The man died of a heart attack. Room 4 was blessed that morning, right on schedule, and I put in my 2 weeks' notice. The Slender Man. It was near the end of high school, 2006 fall in northern Wisconsin. One Friday after school, I was over at my high school boyfriend Jay's house playing video games. Around 7 p.m., we typically would meet up with our whole crew at a local restaurant, but we still had several hours to kill. We were getting bored, and it was so lovely out, so Jay suggested we go walk the train tracks on the west side of town. The town has been built up so much since then, but at the time there was only a Fleet Farm and a small burger joint near the tracks. Miles and miles of woods on either side surrounded the tracks. I agreed, and we jumped in his car and drove across town and parked his car at the side of the burger joint. At this point, it was late afternoon. About dusk, the sun was about to set. We hopped out of the car and walked about a block where the train tracks crossed the street and took a right down the tracks through the woods. We're walking down, balancing on the tracks, talking crap, jumping over stuff, for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. Up ahead of us, we could see a few boxcars off to the side of the tracks. This feels creepy, but it was normal. As we approached them, we could see there were 2 boxcars attached to each other, maybe another 10 to 20 feet, and then a single boxcar behind them. I got the heebie-jeebies as we approached the boxcars, but they were both shut. As we peeked around at them, climbed up, etc., they were less menacing. Cool. We kept walking. The sun was now down, and it was twilight. We got past maybe another length of a boxcar when I just had the sense to look up. That's when I saw it. I swear the hairs on my arms stood up, and suddenly I felt like a prey animal that had been spotted. "Jay, what's that up there? There's someone on the tracks." He stopped and looked up. What looked like maybe half a mile to a mile down the tracks, standing directly in the middle, was the shape of a person, or what I thought was. But for how far away it was, the figure was unnaturally tall, standing stiff and still, arms at sides with what looked like a bowler hat. We need to go," he said. He grabbed my hand and spun me back in the direction we came from. My heart was pounding, and I looked back over my shoulder. This person, who was originally about a mile away, was so much closer. It's like he suddenly jumped half the distance between where he originally was to where we were. But still, the same sickeningly tall, featureless shadow with a hat, standing still, arms to sides, stood in the middle of the tracks. "Jay!" I actually screamed, making him whip his head around. I've never seen this guy scared. He grabbed my hand tighter and broke off into a sprint. Jay is about 6 feet and I'm 5'4", so his stride is a bit longer than mine. We ran past the boxcars off to the side, and as we were about to get past the two that were hooked together, I stole one more frantic look over my shoulder. There he was, one boxcar away, same weird proportions, like a dark, opaque shadow. I swear my eyes bugged out of my head, and my body and adrenaline said GTFO. We plowed forward, no more glances, and frantically fumbled our way back into his car, locked the doors, and sped off to the hangout spot. We told them what we saw, but to this day, no one believed us. I told my dad later on, and he said so many people died building that railroad. It was probably a ghost. Thanks, Dad. The Walking Dead. I'm a psychiatric nurse, and early in my career, I worked at a residential mental health facility. One of our residents was an elective mute, which means that he didn't, wouldn't, or couldn't talk. But there were no medical reasons as to why. He had spoken earlier in his life and in fact seemed quite normal back then, with the exception of being close to 7 feet tall. He'd been raised in the Deep South and joined the military when he was 19, but one night he vanished. He was declared AWOL, and eventually he was declared missing and dead. 10 years later, a 7-foot-tall man walked into a VA hospital emergency room in my part of the Midwest and said to the receptionist, "My name is Marion Dutch. Disclaimer, not the real name. And I've been dead for 10 years. Those were the last words he ever spoke. He was covered with dust, and he was wearing the same clothes he'd been reported to be wearing the night he vanished. His social security number had not been used, and he had no identification on his person. However, they were able to identify him, I guess, via fingerprints. The family was notified, but they said they had already grieved their lost man, and that whomever was claiming to be him simply could not be. They demanded not to be contacted again. Marion paced all day, every day, moving his mouth that looked like talking or muttering, but no sound came out. He had an unnerving habit of throwing his head back with his mouth wide open, as if he were laughing heartily, but not even a breath could be heard. If I talked to him, he appeared to listen, periodically throwing his head back in that laughter-mimicking way of his. Various medications were tried, but they did not affect him either positively or negatively. Occupational therapy did nothing because Marion would just grin, and unless told to stay put, he'd get up and start pacing again. On my last day at that job, the last thing I saw was Marion, pacing in the parking lot, throwing his head back to laugh. Later, I wondered if all along I'd been dealing with a ghost. All these years later, I still don't know. It came for us in the graveyard. We were driving my friend's really old beat-up Subaru through a massive graveyard. We stopped and walked down a hill and came across a little pond. There was someone sitting on a rock on the other side of the pond. The figure was all black, and we couldn't make out any features other than the fact it looked like a man who was wearing some old-style top hat. We stupidly waved and shouted, "Hi!" He didn't show any acknowledgement and continued sitting still on the rock. All of a sudden, he jumped to his feet, started running to us on the water, and then vanished in thin water about halfway on the pond. My friends and I screamed and ran back to the car. The car wouldn't start, and we heard something banging on the back of the car. It wasn't a constant bang, but every few seconds or so we'd hear it. Nobody was outside from what we could see in the dark, but something was making a noise on the car. I opened my phone and started dialing my mom to come give us a boost, but I had no service. None of us had any cell service. The next 30 minutes were spent trying to get her car started. No banging was heard afterwards, but we felt this heavy pressure around us. Finally, the car started and she hit the pedal to the metal. We sped out of the graveyard so fast. Immediately crossing the gates, all of our phones regained cell service. One thing I know for certain is that someone or something was out there, and it was not an animal or a human. Do you have a similar story? Please share in the comments below.